Richard Nixon was the 37th President of the United States of America. He was born on January 9, 1913, in Yorba Linda, California. Nixon joined the U.S. Navy and served as an operations officer in the Pacific during World War II. Richard Nixon won large amounts of money playing poker in the Navy and funded his first campaign. Nixon launched his political career in 1946, representing his California district in the U.S. House of Representatives. He rose to national prominence by leading a controversial investigation of Alger Hiss. Nixon became vice president by winning the election of 1952 with Eisenhower and was re-elected in 1956. Nixon claimed the Republican presidential nomination, but lost one of the closest elections in American history to U.S. Senator John F. Kennedy in 1960. He prevailed in the 1968 U.S. presidential election in the middle of the Vietnam War. Nixon did few but important reforms domestically. Supplemental Security Income, SSI, which provided a guaranteed income to the elderly, the blind, and the disabled. Nixon's administration instituted so-called set-aside policies to reserve a certain percentage of jobs for minorities on federally funded construction projects. This was the first affirmative action program. His revenue-sharing program, called New Federalism, provides state and local governments with billions of federal tax dollars. Nixon undoubtedly preferred world affairs over domestic. He said in 1968, "I've always thought this country could run itself domestically without a president." Nixon's main goal in his presidency was peace in Vietnam. Under his policy of Vietnamization, combat roles were transferred to South Vietnamese troops. However, he made great advances in Soviet and Chinese relations as well. Nixon traveled to Beijing in February of 1972 to discuss several diplomatic topics. Besides the visit's enormous symbolic meaning, the two nations came to terms on several different agreements. They agreed that neither nations would try to dominate the Pacific, and they would cooperate in settling disputes peacefully. Also, America would recognize Taiwan as part of China's homeland. Nixon also traveled to Moscow 3 months later. After a series of meetings called Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, Nixon and Brezhnev signed the SALT I Treaty. This 5-year agreement limited the amount of ballistic missiles that the nations could have. In 1972, Nixon defeated his Democratic opponent, Senator George S. McGovern, in one of the largest landslide victories in the history of American presidential elections, 46.7 million to 28.9 million in the popular vote and 520 to 17 in the electoral vote. However, Nixon would be forced to resign as president because of the Watergate scandal. Watergate scandal was a major political scandal that occurred in the United States in the 1970s as a result of the June 17, 1972 break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office complex in D.C., and the Nixon administration's attempted cover-up of its involvement.
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
The scandal led to the discovery of multiple abuses of power by the Nixon administration, articles of impeachment, and the resignation of Richard Nixon. Gerald Rudolph Ford Jr. was the 38th President of the United States of America. He was born in Omaha, Nebraska on July 14, 1913. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1948 and would serve in the House for the next 25 years, earning a reputation as a friendly, honest, loyal, and hardworking Republican. As the Watergate scandal came to light, Vice President Spiro T. Agnew resigned from office in October 1973 over unrelated charges of accepting bribes and evading taxes. Nixon used his power under the 25th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution to appoint Ford as his new vice president. Ford defended Nixon and represented the administration, but Nixon chose to resign from office on August 9, 1974, rather than face an impeachment trial over his role in the scandal. In Ford's short term in presidency, he had only a few domestic policies and foreign affairs. He started with pardoning Nixon for the Watergate scandal, saying that he had a full, free, and absolute pardon for all offenses. Ford told Americans on September 8, 1974, that Nixon had suffered enough because the threat of prosecution was damaging Nixon's health, and because the trial of the ex-president would ignite bitter and divisive passions which would prevent the country from moving forward.
Now therefore, I, Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, pursuant to the pardon power conferred upon me by Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, have granted, and by these presents do grant, a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States which he, Richard Nixon, has committed or may have committed or taken part in during the period from July 20, 1969 through August 9, 1974.
The only other domestic affair Ford dealt with was an inflation crisis causing a recession in the economy. Ford acted by creating WIN, Whip Inflation Now. It was a campaign to spur grassroots movements to fight this inflation, encouraging personal savings and disciplined spending. Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford are two great presidents who were able to help the country rebuild in times of hardship and need. Our country would not be as great without them.